So we found that that emptiness meditation outperformed mindfulness across all of the outcome variables that we used in this study, which were measures of non-attachment to self, of compassion, of mystical experience, and of positive and negative feelings.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring research into the Buddhist concept of emptiness. My guest is Dr. William Van Gordon, who lectures and conducts research on the psychology of Buddhist meditation at the University of Derby in England. He was a Buddhist monk for 10 years and received monastic ordinations in various Buddhist schools, including the higher ordination within the Theravada Buddhist tradition. William sits on the editorial board for various academic journals, including Mindfulness and Mindfulness and Compassion. He is internationally recognized as an expert in the research and practice of mindfulness and Buddhist meditation. William has over 100 academic publications, including in leading refereed medical and psychology journals. He is co-editor of 2 anthologies, Mindfulness and Buddhist-derived Approaches in Mental Health and Addiction, and the Buddhist Foundation of Mindfulness. This is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, William. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Nice to be with you again, Jeff.
You've done some very interesting research. In fact, I gather you've spent most of your career looking at mindfulness as a Buddhist meditative practice. Today, we're going to look at a different practice known as emptiness. Can you sort of distinguish for our viewers the difference between emptiness and mindfulness?
Sure. Emptiness and mindfulness, they really fall into two separate categories of meditation. Mindfulness is more to do with concentrating the mind, whereas emptiness meditation is more to do with using that concentration in order to investigate the mind and investigate phenomena.
So why is it called emptiness? It sounds like if you're engaged in investigating the mind itself, it would be a kind of fullness rather than emptiness.
Yes, in fact, emptiness is just one rendering of the principle or the concept as it was introduced throughout the Buddhist literature, and it really means that any given phenomena, including ourselves, does not exist independently, and that therefore it's empty of an independently existing self. Yet at the same time, by default, that means that it's full of all other phenomena. So personally, I'm not 100% comfortable with with the term emptiness. It doesn't quite capture the idea. It almost has some negative connotations attached to it. But emptiness can equally mean fullness.
That's very interesting. I assume that emptiness is somehow also related to the Buddhist concept of nirvana, which I hear people describe as somehow akin to emptiness.
In many respects, yes. The idea is that once we're able to let go of a strong attachment to self, to me, to mine and I, that opens our perspective such that we can embrace and experience much more of reality. So that would be where the nirvana link begins to come in. As soon as we let go of self, we can embrace other. We can embrace reality in its full extent.
I understand that the concept of mindfulness has now been studied by the psychology research community, the community of researchers such as yourself who study meditation. It's been studied for decades, and there are hundreds of studies talking about the benefits of mindfulness. But emptiness is also a meditative practice that has not been studied so extensively.
Yes, that's right. In fact, we've really seen a three-phase evolution of meditation research, particularly in respect of Buddhist-based meditation research. Starting in the late 1980s, focus began to explore mindfulness in terms of the construct and its applications. I think at the turn of the century, then approximately 19 years ago, the focus moved to or began to explore techniques such as compassion and loving kindness meditation. But I think in the last 5 years, there's been a further evolution, and there's now a keen interest in exploring principles such as emptiness and non-self and non-attachment, and how we might be able to derive well-being from practicing those.
Mm-hmm. You're an advanced meditative practitioner yourself and a teacher of meditation. I assume from what you're telling me that in order to really practice the emptiness as a meditative practice, one needs to have first achieved a level of mastery over the mindfulness practices.
To a degree, yes, but actually, emptiness is an accessible concept, an accessible practice where it's taught correctly. Unfortunately, it often isn't taught correctly, and there's a lot of confusion about the technique. But the idea that we don't exist independently, the idea that I'm breathing in your out-breath and you're breathing in my out-breath, and we're drinking, so to speak, the rain and the rivers. The idea that there exists other in self and self in other, it's not so hard to grasp with a little bit of time and care in explanation. I think people can and do begin to familiarize themselves more with emptiness and how it relates to them.
It sounds to me, the way you're describing it, that this understanding of emptiness is very much akin to the science of ecology, where we see that in the natural world, everything is interrelated.
Interrelatedness or interconnectedness is an important part of emptiness, but I think it does go one step further, because actually interconnectedness, although it's useful for didactic purposes in terms of understanding emptiness, it also introduces some limitations. The idea that two objects are connected really doesn't do emptiness justice. Emptiness is really implying that phenomena are so connected there's even no boundary between them. There's boundarylessness, if you like, and actually trying to define where one object or phenomena finishes and another starts, it is almost impossible.
You conducted a lengthy research investigation of advanced Buddhist meditators who were capable of entering into this state of emptiness. And I gather you spent a whole year just screening participants in this study. I believe it was a sister study to one we've already talked about, your study of meditation-induced near-death experience, which our viewers found quite fascinating. So let's talk a bit about how you were able to screen applicants for this study.
So we decided to utilize a 12-month recruitment window, really just to make sure that we were comprehensive in terms of bringing in meditation practitioners from different Buddhist schools, so that we had a pan-Buddhist perspective, if you like, and also we wanted to make sure that our participant sample were really eliciting a genuine emptiness experience. So that process took some time.
Given that there aren't any standard measurements for whether or not a Buddhist meditator is in that state of emptiness, how did you determine that these people were in fact capable of achieving that state?
Yes, that's a very good question, and that was a potential challenge that we discussed before embarking on the study, and we navigated our way around that potential issue via implementing two steps. One was to use quite a selective recruitment process. So word of mouth was the avenue we chose. We targeted known Buddhist teachers and asked them to pass the word on to other known Buddhist teachers who would have a good understanding of whether an individual in their circle of meditation practitioners was genuinely eliciting emptiness. And then we administered a screening questionnaire that was really intended to determine whether that individual's perception of emptiness was a good match in terms of key Buddhist scriptures on emptiness. We weren't really interested in their knowledge or ability to regurgitate those scriptures. We were interested in their experiential understanding of the texts.
Well, I understand that in Buddhist practice, sometimes a meditative student or a young monk is going to be tested by a senior monk in terms of their achievement. Often this involves questions and answers or responses to Zen koans and things of that sort. Did you use approaches like that?
We didn't use Zen koans. The questionnaire really was focused on targeting the key experiential components of emptiness. So, for example, we were looking to see that participant hadn't confused emptiness with the idea of non-existence or a nihilistic type approach. We wanted them to understand, we wanted to see that they understood that emptiness means that phenomena exist in the sense that we see them, we're not denying that, but that they exist in perhaps a less concrete manner than most people might have led themselves to believe. So it was a fairly subtle process of inquiry.
I see that, in effect, you're wearing two hats. You are a research psychologist on the one hand and a meditation teacher on the other hand. And it seems to me from your description that you're quite comfortable with those two roles, that they don't really conflict with each other.
I think there's good compatibility because I think really you have to have some understanding of the techniques in order to research it well. And then one tries to use various processes, various bracketing off processes in order to keep one's own perspective apart from others as much as possible. What we did here was we compared participants' responses to that screening questionnaire to a very encompassing pan-Buddhist perspective of emptiness, a very encompassing model that incorporated many different Buddhist views. And so really, if there wasn't at least a reasonable fit between their version of emptiness and the model we used, then probably there's some issue somewhere.
Another concern I have, or some people have expressed, is that there seems to be a cultural distinction between Buddhism as practiced in the West by Westerners and Buddhism as practiced in the East by people from the East. Did you notice any differences of that sort? Did that come up at all as you were recruiting your subjects?
I think you're right. I think there are those cultural differences inevitably, but when we're talking about insight-based techniques, they really ought to transcend those cultural differences. Emptiness is emptiness. It doesn't matter if you're practicing from a Western Buddhist or an Eastern Buddhist perspective. It doesn't even matter if you're practicing from a non-Buddhist perspective. Essentially, the understanding is that this is a truth of nature, a truth of existence. And so, no, we didn't really see that with this particular group of advanced Buddhist meditators.
So, and when you describe emptiness as a truth, I presume what you're saying is that in the process of meditation itself, one is capable of discovering that truth.
That's the intention. The intention is to develop a certain degree of focus and awareness, of meditative concentration, and then to begin investigating the true nature of self, for example. In particular, participants or advanced meditators often try to search for something that they can call me, mine, or I, or self, that exists inherently and independently. And no matter how hard they look, they never find that separately and inherently existing self. And it's from that point of view I'm using the word truth.
Well, let's talk about the results of your study. I guess that after a year in the recruitment process, you found about 25 meditators who met your criteria for this study. And then what happened?
That's right. Then those meditators were asked to engage in their own time, in a natural way, in the practice of eliciting emptiness in meditation. And they were also asked to practice a mindfulness-based meditation that didn't involve any emptiness based techniques or concepts. And immediately before and immediately after each of those two types of meditation, the participants were asked to complete a series of psychometric tests, and then we looked at differences before and after each meditation, and how they compared across the two meditation conditions within the same group of participants.
I'm assuming that you would expect that before the meditation, that when they took the psychometric tests, there would be very little difference before a mindfulness meditation and before an emptiness meditation. Would that be correct?
That's precisely correct. So we actually ran some tests to check that there weren't any significant differences between the start points for both types of meditation, and there weren't in this case. There weren't any differences identified.
So then you're going to be primarily then looking at the differences that are found after each of these meditations. And I guess to sort of short circuit, I guess you found that while both mindfulness and emptiness showed a variety of positive benefits, there was a significant difference between the two.
That's right. So we found that that emptiness meditation outperformed mindfulness across all of the outcome variables that we used in this study, which were measures of non-attachment to self, of compassion, of mystical experience, and of positive and negative feelings.
Let's talk a little bit now about what the experience of emptiness was like as reported by these meditators.
Sure. So another study element that we introduced was an interview where we asked questions really to try and tap into that experiential component rather than just focus on data elicited from psychometric tests. And it seemed that all participants really felt that emptiness meditation was their main source of spiritual insight, if you like. They described it using terms such as it provides them with a spiritual reboot, a form of re-energizing, of reconnecting with what they believe to be the innermost nature of their mind.
How would that compare to the experience that they reported in engaging in mindfulness?
That they typically report a calming, a focusing, a concentration increase following mindfulness meditation, and those benefits are excellent. To be more focused in the present moment, to feel calmer. But there's an element of insight that's often missing from mindfulness practice alone. That insight into how we exist and where we exist. Mindfulness practice alone doesn't really engage with those types of questions or techniques.
And I presume from everything we've discussed so far, all of these practitioners were deeply engaged already in Buddhist practice. So one might say they were all very familiar with the Buddhist concepts to the extent that one could call it a theology, with Buddhist theology and philosophy. So did you make any effort to sort of tease out the experiential component from the potential for indoctrination that occurs in any social organization?
I think to a degree, yes, but I think you're touching on a limitation of the study, because, as you've correctly said, this was an entirely Buddhist participant sample, and yet those Buddhist meditation practitioners came from very diverse and different Buddhist schools that actually have very, very different views on meditation, at least theoretically, on emptiness, and a related concept such as non-self. There's very differing views, and so to that extent, yes, we found that the experiential content that we reported was reflective of all participants, regardless of which particular Buddhist school they came from. There were some minor differences, of course, but you're quite right. I think an important next step would be to bring on board non-Buddhist contemplative practitioners who I understand have very similar experiences, perhaps using different terms, and see if we're still tapping into the precise same emptiness construct.
You know, one of the paradoxes to me that came up in your research is the idea that your meditators reported that while experiencing emptiness, they also felt that they were in control of the meditative process. And that strikes me as a paradox, because if you're saying, well, there is no self, yet who's in control?
Yes, I think that the important thing from that particular study observation to take away is that emptiness meditation wasn't a form of zoning out or tuning out. Participants remained aware of that experience. They were in control of the meditation. They could choose when to terminate that meditation. They were very present and very aware. They were aware of themselves, but they were aware of a very different way of relating to self. It's not that the self ceases to exist in the sense that this body is no longer here. It exists, but it's a much more encompassing notion. And when one lets go of self in the ego sense of the word, a much more dynamic, a much more broader and encompassing notion of self emerges that, according to this and other studies, is much more flexible, much more capable of coping with change, much less likely to get fixed in narrow ways of thinking. So that's the type of self, more adaptive type of self that I think participants were beginning to identify with in the meditation.
I think another interesting finding that you came up with is that the profundity, the intensity of the emptiness experience seemed unrelated to the length of the meditative practice itself.
We interpreted that as being consistent with participants' reports that whilst dwelling in emptiness, while having this experience, they really transcended concepts of time and space. They lost track of time. There was no longer any time as far as they were concerned. And so therefore the length of time they meditated for was less important than the insights that they derived whilst in that state of meditation.
Would it also be the case that the length of time that they had spent practicing meditation, I mean, the number of years they've been in meditative practice, had any impact on the profundity of the meditative experience?
To a degree, one would expect to see that, but not necessarily. There are instances, I think, of individuals really just being able to connect with this practice quite rapidly. So I'm not a big believer that meditation skill necessarily corresponds to years spent in training.
Although, as I recall from our discussion of the sister study you did, that the average person in your study probably had been meditating for over 10 years. Yes.
These individuals in this study and the sister study were classed as advanced meditators. They had undergone a significant amount of training in order to elicit these experiences. But I think the quality of that training is much more important than the quantity with regards to meditation.
Well, I want to thank you once again so much for being with me. You're doing fascinating work. I know that meditation research has really come into a new phase, and you're at the forefront of it. So I'm very, very happy to share your ongoing research with our viewers. William, thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks for having me with you again, Jeff.
3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.